Following its announcement during E3 2015, the Final Fantasy VII Remake became one of the most anticipated games of this generation. But even though it was a remake of a classic game that many of us hold dear, when the final product released, there was still so much about it that was unknown. In the build-up, we had received a demo and read countless interviews with the developers. We'd also been exposed to plenty of pre-release marketing activities, but much of this focused around very early segments of the game and only gave a glimpse of what would follow. In many ways, it was the ideal scenario. They showed off just enough to garner excitement in each of the core audiences they were striving to appeal to, and even veterans were granted a sense of wonder, as even though they would have had preconceived notions about what to expect, they had no idea if the game would play out that way. When the wait was over, plenty of opinions started to filter out across various communities all around the world. Those opinions consisted of a lot of praise and excitement for the future, but also a lot of anger, disappointment, and just confusion about how some aspects of the game had been handled. And that brings us onto this particular initiative. To try and build upon the various discussions that have taken place and the arbitrary review scores that have been given, we wanted to try and provide a more constructive, broader view. And to that end, within this video, we'll be looking at various aspects of the game, narrowing down into the opinions of more granular segments of the community where it makes sense to do so. Not only should this be insightful for the community, serving as validation for certain types of views, but the main objective is to make sure this information gets filtered through to the development team over at Square Enix. We know that they are open to feedback, and if they find any of this information useful, then that can only be beneficial to the future of the Final Fantasy VII Remake project. It's an objective that so many people seemed to resonate with, and I want to thank each and every one of you for helping us to gather this data. I'd also like to thank fellow YouTubers, the Night Sky Prince and Soldier First Class, as well as the various subreddits who helped out with promotion. Through our collective efforts, I'm happy to share that we had 14,455 people take the survey. That is a huge number, and it's blown Lauren and I away. When we conducted our Final Fantasy XV survey, we had 2,602 responses, and we were maybe expecting to hit 5,000 this time. But to receive over 14,000 just from one call to arms is insane, and it means that the insights we'll discuss throughout this video will have so much more substance. And with that, here's the structure. First, we're going to break down the core groupings we've identified and will reference throughout the video. We'll then take a look at why those groupings were interested in the game in the first place, before diving straight into how everyone felt about the game at a high level, and then at a more granular level. Focus will then be placed on individual segments relating to gameplay, characters, and content, before taking a look at what people want from the future of the Final Fantasy VII Remake project. If you'd like to skip between these sections, there are timestamps in the description, and while the majority of this video is spoiler-free, towards the end there will be a small spoiler warning present. Alright, so let us begin. The geographic location of respondents had a strong bias towards North America and Europe, but thanks to the sheer volume of responses, even though Asia, Australia and South America only accounted for 15% of responses combined, that still represented over 2,000 independent opinions and has been very useful for showing how views differ around the world on certain subjects. By segmenting based on experience with the franchise, we can see a heavy bias towards respondents who had played the original Final Fantasy VII, but there was decent representation for those who hadn't, and this ratio is quite consistent in every region, with 13% of respondents experiencing Final Fantasy VII for the first time when playing this game. The only region that saw any significant deviation was Asia, where 21% of respondents had never played the original game, and I'd say in some regards this makes sense. Based on their marketing efforts and general goals, Square Enix are always desperate to try and capture the attention of those who have never engaged with the franchise before, and Square Enix Japan spent a lot of time crafting emotive marketing campaigns to try and make younger audiences understand the impact of the original game. And it looks like this worked. But outside of Asia, the performance is not quite as positive as it may seem. If we drill down a bit further, only 4% of respondents said they had never played a Final Fantasy game before, and this does not compare favourably with our Final Fantasy XV survey, where the same segment was 12% of the total. It feels like this is because one of two scenarios has occurred. Either Final Fantasy VII Remake didn't do a good job of appealing to those who had never played a Final Fantasy game before, and the majority of sales came from those who had already played the original, or Final Fantasy VII Remake did bring a lot of new fans in, but not as many of those fans proportionally decided to engage with communities associated with the franchise. Nonetheless, for those who were drawn in for the first time, graphics were one of the main motivators, and this was followed by an interest in the characters, the music, the story, and the artistic design. It highlights that even though this audience had never played Final Fantasy VII before, they were aware of what it represented, and what they saw in the build-up met with their expectations. Among those who had experience with the franchise but had just never played Final Fantasy VII before, it was a love of the franchise that drove their interest. But if we remove that, then their biggest signal was a general interest in RPGs, followed by the story, the characters, the graphics, and the music. For veterans, their primary driver was of course nostalgia, but sweeping that aside, then it was a general interest in RPGs, the story, the music, the characters, and the graphics. A general trend, but the interesting thing is that for newcomers, a general interest in RPGs was not a driving factor. The other thing we looked at was whether marketing initiatives actually played a part. Amongst franchise first-timers, the most important consideration in this regard was word of mouth. This beats out Square Enix's pre-release marketing activities, as well as prominent franchise first-timers streaming the game on platforms like Twitch. It also trumped positive reviews from publications, but in this regard, Final Fantasy VII Remake did perform very well. As of right now, it holds an 88 on OpenCritic and an 87 on Metacritic, placing it as one of the highest rated games of 2020. Respondents to our survey agreed on the whole, scoring the game as a 4.45 out of 5 or an 89. And if we break this down by region, we can see it was pretty unanimous, with Europeans rating it a bit below and South Americans rating it a bit above. The disparity instead came from experience. Whereas veterans rated Final Fantasy VII Remake as an 89, the less experienced gamers had with the franchise, the more impressed they were with the remake on the whole, and franchise newcomers rated the experience as a 92. The group who were least satisfied were those who had played the original Final Fantasy VII and proclaimed they didn't enjoy it, but even they still scored the remake as an 86, which is very positive. To understand more about how people came to this conclusion, we asked for scores against 23 separate criteria, and two aspects stood out for their near universal praise: the music and the character designs. As these were two elements that people were most excited for in the build-up, it's great to see that they delivered, and a sizable team of artists, composers and arrangers should really be commended for their efforts in this regard. Other areas of presentation also received praise, from weapon designs to voice acting and the delivery of story event scenes. And in this regard, respondents were pleased with how the four protagonists were represented, although there was a slight preference for the personality of the female characters. Aerith came out on top, and Barrett came out on the bottom, and that trend was clear no matter how we sliced the data. Those in South America liked the characters more than any other region, but outside of Asia, who didn't seem to resonate as much with Barrett, Cloud or Tifa, all the other regions were pretty aligned with their scoring. This wasn't the case though with experience, as Cloud and Barrett scored worst with people who had experience with the franchise but had never played the original. Tifa then scored worst with franchise newcomers, and Aerith was the only character who was actually preferred by franchise newcomers. If we look at elements that were not as well received relatively to the others, then the elephant in the room is the amount and variety of additional content. This was by far the lowest rated element, and it will definitely need to be addressed in the next installment. Map design, general navigation and sub-character design were also called out, and Sephiroth's personality was the third lowest rated category, primarily due to veterans not being pleased with his early appearance. If we then look at the same breakdown by the big three regions, opinion was pretty consistent. The main points of contention came from the lower rated elements, such as the amount and variety of content and the sub-character design. Another general trend was that outside of the main character design, Europeans were least satisfied with pretty much every single aspect of the game, whereas North Americans were the most satisfied. Experience also played a crucial role in enjoyment. On average, those with the least experience with the franchise enjoyed the game the most. The only individual elements veterans preferred were the graphical quality and Tifa's personality. But when it came to comparing the two groups of Final Fantasy veterans, it was much more split. Those who had played the original game were more impressed with the granular elements of the story, such as the dialogue and the individual character personality, but were more dissatisfied with the story as a whole. And this explains why, when we looked into why people had stopped playing, story was the main reason given. Another segment that determined satisfaction was the initial difficulty setting. Upon starting out for the first time, it was possible to select easy, normal, or the custom-created classic mode that was meant to appease veterans who were aggrieved by the shift towards action-based gameplay. It might seem ironic then that those who played the game on classic mode were not only the least satisfied with the battle system, but perhaps because they already went in with a negative sentiment due to the gameplay shift, they were also the least impressed with almost every other aspect of the game. The final segments we're going to look at are price and method of purchase. When the Final Fantasy VII Remake was up for pre-order, you could either purchase a physical copy or a digital download, and you could either purchase the standard, deluxe, or first class editions. By looking at the data, we saw there was no discernible difference between the opinions of physical and digital purchasers, but editions was a different story. Here we saw a clear correlation, as those who spent more enjoyed the game more. But as noted by Purdue University in their 2018 study, money only buys happiness up to a certain point, and it meant that those who shelled out for the first class edition didn't enjoy the game any more than those who had purchased the deluxe edition. Now, the decision to move away from turn-based combat and instead focus on an action-orientated approach caused much consternation, but on the whole, most respondents were impressed with the battle system. There were clear preferences when it came to specific characters though. On the whole, players found more enjoyment when playing as Cloud and Tifa than they did playing as Barret and Aerith, and based on the implementation it's clear why the divide exists, as while they were still powerful, Barret and Aerith were much more passive by comparison. This viewpoint was unanimous across every major region, but it was further accentuated within Europe, where Barret and Aerith received much lower scores comparatively. Outside of geographic region, the difficulty players picked on their first playthrough also played a factor on how much they enjoyed each character. Those who started out with Classic had the lowest enjoyment with every character, whereas those who started on Normal had the highest enjoyment, with Tifa seeing the biggest difference. To push this notion further, a clear trend emerged when studying what people did after they finished the game. Those who didn't replay the game at all had a much more negative outlook on the gameplay experience as a whole, and those who replayed the game on hard rated the gameplay highest. But what's interesting is that outside of Tifa, there was no significant difference between those who replayed on hard and those who replayed on classic, easy, or normal. The other aspect we touched on within gameplay was the summons. Stupidly, we didn't actually ask people if they liked the summon system, but we did find out which summons they preferred the most. In this regard, Bahamut was the clear favourite, with Shiva and Ifrit coming in second and third. Carbuncle also did well considering it was a pre-order bonus, receiving a higher share of votes than Chocomog. Now, the initial scores revealed a high degree of positivity around the main characters, but when it came to the sub-characters and antagonists, sentiment was a bit more mixed. If we start off looking at the sub-characters across the three major regions, we can see that Avalanche were a real positive, and Madame M was a solid addition. Reeve also scored well within North America and Europe, and Marl was well received in Asia. But if we look at every sub-character, we can see that as the combined score decreased, the deviation of the scores between the regions, as shown by the line, increased. And the character with the biggest deviation was Chadley. Europeans had Chadley in their bottom 5, whereas Asia had him closer to the top. One thing every region agreed on though was that they did not like Kyrie. If we look at the bottom 5 for each region, it becomes clear how dissimilar opinions were, as even though there was some consistency in terms of who appeared, the scores were still vastly different. Kyrie was dead last every time though, with Europeans having a real distaste. Deputy Mayor Hart, Jules and Mireille also featured in every region. Very few of the introduced characters in general managed to make any real impact compared to existing characters, despite some of them, such as Leslie and Kyrie, receiving a decent amount of screen time due to their appearance within the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. There was also a strong correlation between like of the characters and experience with the original, as while veterans had a much stronger preference for the older characters, franchise first-timers were a bit more receptive to the new characters. This saw veterans rate every single existing character higher than franchise first-timers, except for one, Johnny. Motomo Toriyama decided to expand Johnny's role within the 7 Remake in a considerable way, and on the whole it wasn't well received. In North America, Johnny was one of the least favourite characters, and veterans approved even less of his expanded role than franchise first-timers. When looking at the antagonists, everything was a bit more consistent. The top 5 characters across the 3 major regions had almost no deviation. Reno, Rude, Rufus and Hojo were mainstays, with those in Asia preferring Sephiroth to Don Corneo. When looking at the bottom 5 characters, it was also much the same as every region included Palmer, Roche, Scarlet and Heidegger. The only exception was again Asia, as they included President Shinra instead of Genova. But unlike the sub-characters, the majority of the antagonists featured within the original game. The only one who didn't was Roche, and he was by far the most divisive antagonist. Along with Palmer, he was also by far the lowest rated, but this was skewed a little as Europeans really did not like Roche. And as we know he is set to appear within Part 2, the scenario writers will really need to think carefully about how they implement his character so that they can try and turn opinions around. Veterans again had a strong preference towards the older characters, with franchise first-timers only rating the appearances of Roche and Sephiroth higher, and this makes sense, as although Sephiroth is an established character, his appearance within the 7 Remake wasn't dissimilar to that of a new character, as he didn't appear within that segment of the original game. And that brings us on to one of the big changes with the 7 Remake, the ending. This represented a huge departure from what happened within the original game, but how did people feel about it? Well, they thought it was alright. Almost 75% of respondents rated it as a 4 or 5 out of 5, and this then saw a natural decline into the lower numbers. But if we average out the scores, we end up with a 3.93 or 79%, and if we're referring back to the initial set of elements, that ranks the ending as the third worst aspect of the game behind the amount of variety of content and the map design. It was Europeans again who gave the ending the lowest score, with those in Asia giving it the highest, but irrespective of how it scored, it did achieve the desired effect. 85% of respondents said they have actively sought out information relating to the ending, but it's what they choose to do next that's important, because it will either bring people around or lose those who were on the fence, as even though many have felt reinvigorated, the ending was controversial, and such was its impact that it affected enjoyment of the game as a whole. How people scored the ending had a direct correlation with how they scored every other aspect of the game, irrespective of whether it related to the story, and this scaled as sentiment towards the ending increased. Square Enix will also need to make sure they tighten up the content of the next installment, as opinion was split on the post-game offering. We know that the amount of variety of content was by far the biggest grievance, and only 56% of people felt the post-game content was good enough. This has resulted in very low completion numbers for every activity. Few people bothered to obtain all of the dresses or complete the various challenges found in the Colosseum or the Shinra Combat Simulator. 25% of respondents did complete all the side quests, but this was also the aspect of the game that people wanted improved more than anything else, and this was followed by improvements to the endgame content and the game's length. What's disappointing though is that this continues a common trend. Side quests were also called out as a considerable bugbear within our Final Fantasy XV survey due to how vapid they were, and we really hope the development team are able to figure out how to overcome this clear hurdle with the next game. In that regard, 87% of fans would still like Tetsuya Nomura to continue steering the ship as the game's director, which is a pretty high approval rating, so if you're watching this or information gets back to you somehow, good job Tetsuya. There was a point of contention though. Nomura has spoken many times about how he'd prefer to push for quicker releases that contain less content, and this would result in more parts overall. He feels this is also what the fans want, but according to our survey, it's the complete opposite. 78% said they would prefer longer periods between each release, which would result in less parts, assuming the games themselves contain more content. 85% of respondents then said they would like the 7 Remake project to consist of 3 or 4 parts, with only 6% wanting it to be completed in 2 parts, which was something that has been raised as a possibility. Working along with this, 42% said they would like the next part to conclude just after the Temple of the Ancients, but 39% said they didn't care where it ended, and I think that's rather telling, as there's a decent chunk of people whose focus is just that wherever it ends, it needs to be good. Something that will help to influence this is who will be playable. We saw earlier just how much the styles of each character affected enjoyment of the battle system, and with new characters set to be introduced within Part 2, the development team needs to ensure it feels natural. Some of these characters delve into spoiler territory though, so if you haven't finished the game yet, then either proceed at your own risk or skip ahead to the timestamp being shown on the screen. Now, based on comments by Naoki Hamaguchi, we know that Red 13 will be appearing as a playable character in the next game, and 22% of people voted him as the character they would like to see most, but he was beaten out by Vincent Valentine, who received 24% of votes. This pair was then followed by Yuffie Kisaragi and Zack Fair, with nobody showing much interest in the prospect of playing as Cid Highwind, Sephiroth or Cait Sith. What's interesting though is how much this differed by region. In Asia, Zack Fair was a very popular choice. Red 13 though was not that appealing, as he ranked 5th behind Sephiroth. But in Europe, Red 13 was the most anticipated character, followed by Vincent and then Zack. There was also a preference for Knights of the Round to appear as a summon materia in the next part, with Odin, Phoenix and Bahamut Zero also being popular choices. It is difficult to see Knights of the Round appearing though, as it will no doubt be saved for the big finale, but there's a good possibility of seeing Odin and Phoenix, but that will also depend on whether they're influenced by what Yoshida is doing with Final Fantasy XVI. We'll just have to wait and see how it plays out though. But yeah, with that we're about ready to wrap things up. Thank you so much for watching if you're still with us. It's been a bit of a slog, but I truly hope you found the insights we've covered here useful. If you did, then give yourself a pat on the back and toss us a like. We'd also love to hear what you thought about the insights, and if you could help spread the word, it would be very much appreciated. We'll make sure to send it through to our contacts at Square Enix, but there's no harm in everyone giving them a nudge on social media too. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. A big thanks again to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, and of course, a big thanks to all of you for watching this video. I hope to see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.